The First Anglo-Afghan War was fought between the British East India Company and the Emirate of Afghanistan, the ultimate victor. The British were keen to control Afghanistan as they feared Russian expansion into South Asia, but the local tribesmen were fierce fighters. The war was extremely costly and included the disastrous retreat from Kabul in 1842. In the 19th century, Ranjit Singh, 1780–1839, leader of the Sikh Empire, had greatly increased his territory in several military campaigns, which included defeating Afghan raiders and taking control of Lahore. Singh went on to take over Multan and Kashmir, 1819, Ladakh, 1833, and Peshawar, 1834. The British East India Company, meanwhile, controlled much of the rest of India, either via direct rule or through a network of subsidiary alliances with Indian princely states. The ඊᴏᴜ had also won a string of victories in conflicts like the four Anglo-Mysore Wars, 1767–1799, the three Anglo-Maratha Wars, 1775–1819, and the Anglo-Nepalese War, 1814–1815. The ඊᴏᴜ, effectively the colonial arm of the British government in Asia, next turned its attention to the very north of the Indian subcontinent and the frontier with Afghanistan. In the wider world of empires, the British were concerned above all with the ambitions of their great rival Russia. The so-called Great Game was played between these two empires and it revolved around control of Central Asia. Persia and Afghanistan had acted as a buffer zone between these two empires, but each power sought to gain influence in that zone at the expense of their rival. This influence largely came from supporting one ruler or another against rival political factions. But another complication was the instability of relations between the Afghans and the Sikh Empire, which resulted in a constantly changing frontier. By 1838, the British feared that Russia intended to make a move on its Indian interests by involving itself, or even taking over Afghanistan. In 1837, Persia, with Russian support, had besieged the city of Herat in northern Afghanistan. From there, Russia might move its influence eastwards and gain control of the crucial Khyber Pass, a mountain route on what became known as the Northwest Frontier, which gave access to the plains of what is today Pakistan. Trade had long been conducted through this pass, but it could also be the road by which a Russian military invasion of India was launched. It was to forestall this possible Russian plan that the ඊᴏᴜ decided to send a military force to the very north of the subcontinent, an inhospitable region that has embarrassed the military logistics of many powerful states from antiquity right up to the present day. The Governor-General of the ඊᴏᴜ in 1838 was Lord Auckland, 1784–1849, and he decided on decisive action to strengthen Britain's position in the Great Game. Auckland sponsored a military expedition to enter Afghanistan and remove from the capital Kabul by force the Afghan ruler, Amir Dost Muhammad, 1793–1863, who had shown alarming signs of ruling independently of British guidance. Dost Muhammad was also demanding control of Peshawar, then part of Ranjit Singh's Sikh Empire, an issue that could lead to an explosive war across the entire northern part of the subcontinent. The new puppet ruler was to be 𝙎ᴜᴜ, a former Afghan king, 1803–1809. Crucial military assistance was to be given by Ranjit Singh, with whom 𝙎ᴜᴜ had long been on good terms. The first move in the game came in June 1838 when the ඊᴏᴜ signed a treaty with Ranjit Singh and 𝙎ᴜᴜ promising to protect existing borders. The ඊᴏᴜ's military intentions were then boldly announced in the Simla Manifesto of October 1838. Through November and December of 1838, two British Army columns, one from Bombay, Mumbai, and the other from Bengal, headed for Afghanistan. As it turned out, the British badly overestimated local support for 𝙎ᴜᴜ. Not for the first time in their colonial exploits, the British had also convinced themselves that besides achieving a pro-British buffer zone between themselves and Russia's sphere of influence, they would also be enabled to assist in restoring the union and prosperity of the Afghan people. In both of these aims, the British were to be sorely disappointed. The British army that entered Afghanistan in March 1839 numbered around 21,000 soldiers and was led by Sir John Keane. This force did not face any unified opposition from the Afghan tribal leaders. The British benefited from the Afghans having no centralized army except the private army of 4,500 men created by Dost Muhammad. In Afghan warfare, troops were raised as and when required through the carrot of prospective booty. There were to be no open battles in this war, but this was not to the advantage of the British. The British were armed with bayonet muskets, swords, and artillery. The Afghans relied heavily on the long-barreled and rather antiquated but highly accurate match or flintlock musket known as the 𝙎ᴜ. The 𝙎ᴜ had a distinctive curved stock, which allowed more accurate fire from a horse. It was also an excellent weapon for snipers as the 𝙎ᴜ had around twice the range of the standard British musket of the period. Afghan soldiers also had swords and knives, in particular, the super-sharp 꽕ᴜ, which the British dubbed the Khyber knife. The British force did face harassing attacks and sniper fire through the passes, but no great army came to meet it. Dost Muhammad, in any case, preferred to allow the British to stretch out their supply lines and let the terrain do the damage. Indeed, the greatest test was a logistical one given the great distance from the 𝐼C army bases. Poor planning meant the British soldiers were soon put on half rations and the camp followers on quarter rations. Without roads, the supplies had to be transported by camel, but the land was so hostile that fodder had to be transported, too, ballooning the number of pack animals required. As so often in the region's history, entering Afghanistan and then keeping control, there were two entirely different objectives. Without significant military opposition in the field, the British felt confident enough to crown Shah Shuja the new emir on April 25, 1839 in Kandahar. In July 1839, the fortress of Ghazni, which guarded the route to Kabul, was taken after the British found out the Kabul gate was not properly blocked. The wooden gate was blown up by a Bengal engineer Henry Durand using sacks of gunpowder, which was just as well since the British had neither heavy guns nor siege equipment to attack a fortress with a reputation for being impregnable. The fall of the fortress gave the British access to desperately needed food supplies. The 𝐼C army entered Kabul in August, and by September, the situation was already considered stable enough to send the Bombay army home. Dost Muhammad had fled Kabul when he had heard the news of the fall of Ghazni, but he did not give up his throne so easily. He led a force which defeated a small contingent of 𝐼C cavalry at Perwindura on November 2. The victory had no real value though, as the former emir could not gather any united support from his countrymen, split as they always had been by family loyalties. Criticized ever since for being too cautious when a direct attack on Kabul may well have seen the British retreat in haste, Dost Muhammad gave himself up to the invaders later in November, and was exiled to India shortly after. The British now found themselves having to govern a people that did not want to be governed by foreigners. They tried to use bribes to exploit the age-old factions between the various Afghan tribes, which, though moderately successful at first, was a strategy that could not be sustained long-term as the British increasingly became the common enemy. Another weakness of the British occupation was the necessity to garrison forts in remote areas which then had little support from other British outposts. The military coup and subsequent occupation, the unpopularity of Shah Shuja, Auckland's reforms in Afghanistan like the decision to reduce subsidies paid to local tribes, and anger at the fraternization between British soldiers and Afghan women, all combined to create the volatile conditions which led to a popular uprising and out-and-out war in 1841. The Afghan tribal leaders were still not at all united, but they at least had a common goal: kick the British out of Afghanistan. Civil unrest in Kabul in November 1841 led to a mob killing Alexander Burnes, an important political officer of the East India Company. The unrest quickly spread as garrisons like the Gurkhas, 𝐼C allies, at Cherikar and the British at Ghazni were annihilated. There were some minor successes, such as the defense of the outpost of Jalalabad against the odds by a British force led by Sir Robert Sale, but the writing was on the wall for the British occupation. In Kabul, the lack of a decisive response to the unrest from the British only led to the situation worsening as more and more tribal leaders entered the fray. The 𝐼C army was permanently camped outside the city, and its poor position for defense now became significant. The British troops came under fire from Afghan cannons and snipers hidden in the hills overlooking their camp. Miscommunications, blunders, and the loss of supplies meant the British lost control of the city. Low on supplies of ammunition and food, and with little prospect of any relief coming to their aid, the British army was forced to negotiate a withdrawal from Kabul in December. During this wrangling of terms, Sir William Macnaghten, 1793–1841, the 𝐼C envoy to Kabul, was murdered by Akbar Khan, 1816–1845, the son of Dost Muhammad. Clearly, the British position was a desperate one. To make matters even worse, the winter weather was bleak, and heavy snow was falling in Kabul and in the passes the 𝐼C army would have to negotiate to reach the safety of India. On January 1, 1842, the Afghan leaders agreed to permit a peaceful withdrawal of the British army and its attendants from Afghan territory. The British force was commanded by Major General William Elphinstone, 1782–1842, who came in for much criticism for not decisively quashing the rebellion when it had been in its early stages. The British force of 4,500 soldiers and 12,000 camp followers left Kabul and headed for Jalalabad. To ensure the withdrawal was peaceful, 4 British officers were taken hostage. As it turned out, the more aggressive of the Afghan leaders got their way and consistently attacked the rear of the British column as it departed the country. In the chaotic withdrawal, camels and supplies were taken by raiders and 12 wives and 22 children of British officers were taken hostage. One of these, Lady Sale, survived her 9-month ordeal to write a best-selling diary of her captivity. The British had no tents and very few supplies as they crossed rivers and the inhospitable terrain. Hypothermia claimed many lives. By January 10, there were only around 4,000 survivors from the original 16,500 that had departed Kabul. On January 11, the British column was attacked while going through the Jagdalak Pass. On January 12, Elphinstone was taken hostage when he naively attended a conference with Akbar Khan to negotiate some sort of ceasefire. The general later died of dysentery. With only around 80 men left to fight, a last stand was made on January 13 on Gandamak Hill just outside the village of that name. Only one European survived the retreat from Kabul, Dr. Britton, who made it to Jalalabad on a lame pony. The retreat and destruction of an entire army was one of the worst military disasters in the history of the British Empire. Meanwhile, Shah Shuja was assassinated in April 1842. The British occupation of Afghanistan was at an end.